So the gender pay gap is the difference between the take-home wages for men and women. That's the most simple way of explaining it. But there's obviously a lot more to it. Men and women do different jobs. They work different types of hours. They take different risks at the jobs that they do. They have different flexibilities. So the gender pay gap, despite what you may think, is not about discrimination, not necessarily anyway. It can be, but very often it's about the different choices that men and women make. The first thing that you need to know is that it's actually illegal in the UK to pay men and women differently if they're doing the same job. And it's been illegal since 1975. We still have the gender pay gap. And why do we have it? Because men and women are making different choices about the sort of jobs that they want to do. Now that doesn't mean that gender discrimination doesn't exist. And it doesn't mean that gender stereotyping doesn't exist and that isn't bad. And those are both things that can affect the gender pay gap. But just because this number is going up or is going down, that doesn't tell you anything about what's going on with equality in this country. So let's take as an example an airline company that employs pilots and flight attendants, and let's say all the flight attendants are women and all the pilots are men, and pilots are paid more than flight attendants. So in this case, you would have a gender pay gap. The men employed by the company are paid more than the women. But that's not necessarily because there's any discrimination going on. The women aren't being discriminated. If, for example, more men were hired as flight attendants, they would be getting the same wages as the women. And if any women applied to become pilots, they would get the same wages as the men, as the pilots do currently. So if you change the composition of who is doing the jobs, the gender pay gap would reduce. But just because we know there's a gender pay gap in this company doesn't tell us that anyone is discriminating against anyone. So one really interesting thing about the gender pay gap, which is a little bit counterintuitive at first, is the fact that countries that have low women's labor force participation tend to have lower gender pay gaps as well. You wouldn't have thought so, but if you think about it, you start out with men working the whole spectrum of jobs, from the lowest paid to the highest paid. And if you have low labor force participation for women, there are very few women working. They're only working in the high paid jobs, because otherwise it's not worth their while. So in those sort of situations, in those countries, you'll have a very low gender pay gap. Sometimes it'll even be negative. You'll have countries where so few women work, but they only work really, really fancy jobs. And in that case, the average woman is making more money than the average man. And this was the case in Bahrain, I think, some years ago. They had a negative gender pay gap of 40%. But of course, that was because hardly any women were working. So the UK government started last year to demand of companies that have more than 250 employees to report their gender pay gaps. So this is now mandatory for them, not for smaller companies, but all they have to do is report the gender pay gap, which goes onto a public a website where you can look up these numbers, but they are so far not, there's no requirement for them to reduce it. What does happen though is, because this data is public, is that anyone, including you, including journalists, can look through the data and then publicize particularly what they think are really bad examples of large gender pay gaps. Yeah, so there's a really fun thing called Goodhart's Law that comes into play when we were talking about the gender pay gap. And to give you an example of it, let's say that someone promises you a bar of chocolate for every book that you read. And what they want to do is they want you to read books, to appreciate books. What you want is just the chocolate. So you start reading the shortest books you can, you start reading only comic books, and you get all the chocolate. So this is an example of Goodhart's Law, when the measure becomes a target and then it's not a good measure anymore. So the number of books became the target, and then you tried to trick it in a way that it wasn't a good measure anymore. And it's a similar thing happens with the gender pay gap. If it becomes a target, if the government demands that companies reduce it, then companies will start to think of ways to game the system. Just like you were reading all the comic books, companies could then, for example, only stop hiring women for the low-paid jobs, which is not the intention of what the government wants, but that would be the final result. Okay, so here we have a hypothetical company with the income distribution of the men and the women that are employed by this company. The women are in orange and the men are in blue. And we have two ways of showing the income distribution. The one at the top is dividing them into quartiles, which is basically quarters. So each square represents the lowest quarter, and then the two middle quarters, and then the highest paid quarter in the company. And you can see that on the right, in the highest quarter, it's mainly men, and on the left, in the lowest paid quarter, it's about half-half. There's some women and some men. On the bottom, we also see the same income distribution, but it has a lot more detail. So again, on the left are the lowest paid workers, and on the right, there are very few very highly paid workers, and some men and some women. So what's happening now is that the company is one by one firing the lowest paid women and replacing them by low paid men. So the orange squares are being replaced by blue squares on the left-hand side of the screen. You can also see the two vertical lines, the orange one and the blue one, coming closer and closer together. Those are the median wages for the women and the men. And the closer these two lines come, the smaller the gender pay gap is between them. And by the end, it will be 0. So this is just a little toy example that I made up. This isn't an actual company or anything, but I wanted to demonstrate the Goodhart's law, what a company could do if their only aim is to reduce the gender pay gap. This would be an example of what they could do, and this is not something that we want. The problem with measures like the gender pay gap is that it's a very simple measure that's trying to encompass a very complex reality about how men and women make their decisions. And it's really important to not forget the complexity behind it. Sometimes simple measures can be very useful, but we need to be careful in how we use them and make sure that we understand what's going on.